Hello everyone, welcome to our video lecture on priming. But before getting into what priming is and how it works and how it is relevant to social psych research, I first want to give you a little bit of background information on our two brain systems. So according to social neuroscience research, there are two separate brain systems that process information. There is system 1, which is our automatic processing situation or system. So this basically it functions on its own automatically and outside of our conscious awareness. So it is a very fast, low effort process because we are not putting conscious effort into it. It's something that works on its own. Now with system 2, this is our controlled processing system. So this system requires conscious attention and effort. So it is a slower system because we are having to put in our time and our effort and our attention into this type of processing. So first let's go into detail a bit about system 2 and then we will revisit system 1. So system 2 again is considered our controlled rational way of thinking and processing. It requires our deliberate conscious effort and intentional thinking. So what I want you to try to revisit is when you were learning how to do a very complex task such as driving. So if you remember when you were in driver's ed, the first time you got into the car, you were going through that sort of safety checklist and you were putting a lot of effort into every little action that it takes to safely drive a car. So when you are newer to driving, you are really paying attention to those fine details and you're putting a lot of conscious thought and effort into paying attention to those smaller details such as adjusting your mirrors, trying to remember the right pedals to use and when to use them, like when you should start braking, things like that. So whenever you're putting effort into thinking about the fine details of a situation, you are utilizing system 2. So revisiting system 1, again, this is automatic. So our brains are always doing this type of processing, and again, without our conscious knowledge or effort. So in fact, about 95% of our processing is thought to be utilizing system 1. So what system 1 allows us to do, it allows us to sort of operate on autopilot. It allows us to do familiar tasks without constantly having to think about those fine details. So when you practice something long enough, you typically don't really have to put a lot of thought into the details because it's something that's become sort of like second nature to you. So let's revisit the driving example. So as you are more and more familiar with driving, especially if you are in the same vehicle that you've been in for a long period of time, when you are driving on those familiar routes, so maybe you take the same route to work or to school, you can get from point A to point B without even realizing it. So I think we've all had those moments, as scary as it is, when we get in the car and then all of a sudden we're at our destination and we don't even really realize it. And that's because we are so familiar with the route and the action of driving that we don't really have to put a lot of thought into those finer details because it's become second nature to us and we already know how to do it. So according to current social neuroscience research, system 1 impacts our behavior a lot more than it was initially thought to. So therefore, it's very important to understand how this automatic processing works. And once we understand how it works, we can get more insight into how it ultimately affects our behavior. So this brings us to priming. So priming utilizes system 1. So priming is, by definition, the activation of particular connections and or associations in our long-term memory just before carrying out an action or a task. So this is a process by which our perception or experience or exposure to a specific stimuli leads to an increase in accessibility to our memories and relevant adjacent material. So it activates a specific association that exists in our memory, and how these inserted images and ideas can impact our interpretations of a subsequent situation and what we recall from that situation, as well as our performance and efficiency of the recalling and the entire performance of that situation as well. So going in, how does priming work? So we, first of all, rely on our long-term memories a lot to help us function in day-to-day life. It basically, the way priming works relies on the way our long-term memory stores information. So our information is stored in units, which is referred to as schema, in our long-term memory. So essentially, these schema, this is sort of like a filing cabinet. We sort information by topic and categories, and then when we need to, activation of those specific stimuli levels can be increased or decreased by what we're exposed to in our environment. So when that activation is increased, it therefore becomes more readily accessible to us, and therefore is more likely to enter our conscious awareness and impact our behavior. So essentially what priming can do is it can activate a certain schema and its adjacent or related associated pairings through what is called spreading activation. So I'll get into in a couple of slides what spreading activation is, but essentially when one schema is activated, it also activates associated schema or concepts to a slightly lesser degree. But when those associated concepts are activated, even to a lesser degree, they still become more readily accessible. So I want to give a scenario to sort of help more thoroughly explain how priming works. So what I want you to do, I want you to imagine that you are taking the bus home. So you walk over to your bus stop and you see somebody who's near the bus stop that's nervously pacing back and forth, and they're muttering to themselves, so they're sort of whispering to themselves, and they're looking relatively disheveled and fairly agitated. So in this scenario, there are multiple potential explanations to the situation. So, for example, it could be substance related. It could be a psychological disorder related situation. It could be a situation that's just resulting from extreme stress, or maybe that person is rehearsing a speech that they're nervous to give, and so that's why they're sort of talking to themselves, because they're going through and revisiting those points. We're never really sure, especially if we're not talking to that person, we don't know that person, we can't necessarily know the cause behind that behavior. So let's say you're on your way home, right? But you are actually on UW-Ames campus and you're on your way home from your abnormal psychology course, where you just spent the entire course learning about schizophrenia and the symptoms associated with schizophrenia. So then, as you're walking out of class to your bus stop, you see the pacing individual talking to themselves and responding to what appears to be internal stimuli. So this idea has already been activated in your head about schizophrenia because you just spent the last hour or so talking about it in depth in class, and that information on schizophrenia is more readily accessible to you since you just spent the last hour discussing it in class. You're more likely to interpret that situation as a psychological disorder because you were primed to think about it in your class. And that priming led you to interpret that bus stop situation in a different way than you may have done without coming from that abnormal psychology class. So for example, if instead of schizophrenia in your abnormal psych class, you were talking about substance-related issues, you may then interpret that same situation as a substance-related problem. So another example of this is called medical students' disease. So what medical students' disease is, it's a concept where students that are in medical school misinterpret symptoms they're experiencing as symptoms of a disease they're studying because they're constantly studying various disorders and diseases and medical problems, and they are studying their symptomology in depth. It may then lead them to misinterpret their own symptoms as one of those diseases they're studying due to that prime. So that information about that specific disease or disorder being readily available to them, they may misinterpret their own symptoms to that disease they're studying instead of what they are actually experiencing. So for example, if they are spending time learning about brain tumors and one of the symptoms that they've talked heavily about are really strong headaches, and then the next day they wake up and they have a really strong headache, they may misinterpret that really strong headache as a brain tumor instead of being related to something else. So why is priming important? Why am I devoting a whole lecture to the concept of priming? So priming utilizes, again, that system 1, which is highly influential in our everyday lives, but again, we're often unaware of its operation because it relies on that system 1 that does automatic processing, and therefore we're not aware of the impact that priming can have on us, because a lot of times when we experience a prime, we're not aware that we've actually experienced a prime. So social information processing is extremely complex. There are so many different levels to understanding and to how each individual goes through and sort of interprets the environment around them. So understanding not only how priming works, but how it impacts us as a whole may help us better understand human behavior. So for example, going back to the pacing individual by the bus stop, like I had mentioned before, there's many ways to interpret that situation. And the way that we interpret the situation may be determined by information we were exposed to in an unrelated environment to that situation. So for the example I gave about interpreting it as a psychological disorder, that prime you were exposed to was in your abnormal psychology class that was unrelated to the pacing situation, but it still impacted how you interpreted that situation. So understanding priming and how it may strain our perception or alter our perception and behavior is one way we can understand why we behave and think the way that we do in certain situations. So I do want to give some notes about priming before getting into priming specifically in the context of social psych. So some key takeaways here about priming are that things that we do not even notice can subtly and influence our interpretation of an event or situation and our recall of certain events. So, for example, some research done by Holland and colleagues back in 2005 found that students who were exposed to the scent of all-purpose cleaner were quicker to identify cleaning-related words when given a list of words, and they recalled more cleaning activities when they were asked about their days, and they even kept their desk cleaner than those who were not exposed to the scent of the all-purpose cleaner. So another team of researchers found that students exposed to a cleaning product were less likely to litter when they were leaving the research lab. So all of this exposure to the cleaning product, that occurred without the participants' awareness. So when they were exposed to the cleaning product, it was they were completing the lab activities and somebody was cleaning nearby. They had no idea that that was a part of the experiment. And so they had no idea they were actually being primed. So it just goes to show that even when we're unaware of the information we are taking in, it can still influence our behavior, our performance, and our recall. So this makes priming extremely fascinating because if you all remember from Psych 101 and learning about sensation and perception, we are constantly being exposed to stimuli. And a lot of the stimuli we're exposed to is processed unconsciously, but that stimuli that we encounter can still influence our thoughts and behaviors without us even realizing it. So, for example, another study found that exposure to the color yellow, those who were exposed to the color yellow and the word yellow, they were faster at recognizing the word banana because they were primed with the exposure to yellow. And further research on that found that they were quicker to find words related to yellow than those who are not pre-exposed to the color yellow. So priming, it occurs in everyday life. For example, if you watch like a scary movie, then you may interpret a sound that you hear as a threat, as opposed to just your air conditioner kicking on. So really briefly, I do want to get into the book that's pictured on the left side of this slide. So it's called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It's a really fascinating book that involves social psychology, but it also involves the unconscious processing and a bit of priming. And one of the main takeaways from the book is that much of our social information processing is automatic. So we rely very heavily on that system 1 processing. And again, it's important for us to understand that because that system 1 processing, that automatic processing, does influence the way we behave and interpret situations. So now that we've talked about what priming is and how it's thought to work, now we have to revisit how do we integrate priming into social psych research. So step 1, we have to activate the prime in some way, shape, or form. So the prime can either be something that someone's unaware of, such as the cleaning product. So that's basically exposing the participants without them knowing that they're actually being exposed to a prime. Or they can be exposed to something without understanding the true purpose why they're being exposed to that stimuli, such as through watching like a video or reading a passage. And the purpose of that video or passage would be to influence the emotion or give the group information on a topic, but not the other group. So typically, the prime is included or embedded in the independent variable. And the way we experiment whether that prime had an effect is one group receives the prime, which would be the experimental group, and the other group, the control group, does not. And then step 2, you test the impact of that prime on whatever construct you are interested in investigating. So this is done through measuring your dependent variable. So picking a dependent variable that reflects your construct of interest and then seeing if there's a difference between the group that received the prime and the group that did not. So there are many different types of priming, and I do just want to go through a couple of different types of priming that have been found in social psych research. So the first one is repetition priming. So essentially what repetition priming is when you are exposed to a stimuli or a word once, that will increase the speed of which that same word will be recognized later on. So this happens because once a schema has been activated, it takes less energy and therefore less time to activate that construct again. Another type of priming is associative priming. So this is priming that increases the activation of associated knowledge. So again, this is done through that spreading activation concept I talked about a couple of slides ago. So for example, the word bacon. Bacon can prime people's abilities to recognize the word eggs because bacon and eggs are regularly paired together, therefore they are associated knowledge. So that relies on that spreading activation. So remember that when you activate one concept, the concepts that are paired or associated with that activated concept also get activated to a lesser degree, which is why when the words bacon, the words that are commonly associated with bacon, such as eggs, are more quickly recalled or pointed out in a list than words that are not associated with bacon. So the third type of priming is negative priming. So this is when priming decreases the activation of a particular schema. So this is not as commonly used as the first two types. So commonly, when it is used typically in stereotyping research. So basically, first I want to start stereotypes. There's no such thing as a good stereotype, but unfortunately they do exist. And in stereotyping research, negative priming is used when one person identifies with two groups that have competing or opposite stereotypes. So, for example, maybe they're part of a group that a stereotype involves them being very good at math, but they also identify as with another group that their stereotype is they are bad at math. So if one stereotype is more readily activated through a prime or some sort of contextual cue, the competing stereotype will be inhibited. So speaking of stereotypes, one of the articles to read this week is the Pansau et al. Article. They focus on investigating stereotype threat. So what stereotype threat is, it's a psychological concept where one feels they are at risk of confirming a negative stereotype about a group that they are a part of or identify with. And research on stereotype threat suggests that it can contribute to achievement or performance gaps. So what Pansau and their colleagues investigated was the impact of stereotype threat regarding gender differences in performance on reading tasks. So the assumption of this research is that boys are negatively stereotyped in reading, so they do not, according to the stereotype, perform as well as girls in reading tasks. So the sample of this study was 80 third grade students, and they had two different conditions in their research. So one was a stereotype threat condition, and one was a reduced threat condition. So the stereotype threat condition, kids were told by the experimenter who was posing as a reading teacher that the task they were about to complete was designed to evaluate their ability in reading. With the reduced threat condition, the kids were told by the experimenter who was posing as a video game designer that the task was a new game called Animal Fishing Game, and it was designed for a fun magazine. So both groups, both conditions, had to complete a reading task. They completed the same reading task, which was a test of a silent reading, where kids had to underline under time pressure. So they were told they only have 3 minutes to do this. They had to underline as many animal names as possible in a list of 486 words, where half of those words were animal names. And so the way the performance was evaluated was the total number of animal names correctly underlined within those 3 minutes, minus the total number of errors. So words that were wrongly underlined or animal names that were not underlined. Both groups also completed a post-reading task, which was a questionnaire regarding reading. So this questionnaire included questions about the test itself, so how interesting they found it, but also just about reading in general, including how important reading was to them. And this is what led to the self-identification variable. So there are students who highly identified with reading, so those who were highly motivated by reading tasks and felt that reading was very important to them. And then there were low identified students, so students who did not place as much value on reading. So some of the sample questions were: doing well on reading tasks is very important to me, and I think it's very important to be good at reading. And those two together created that identification variable. So, and those with higher scores on those questions were placed in the higher identifying group. So going a little bit into the results, so what they found was that there was a gender by condition significant association. So what this means is boys basically underperformed girls in the stereotype threat condition, but boys performed just as well as girls in the reduced threat condition. So they also found that when looking just at the girls' performance between the two conditions of stereotype threat and reduced threat, there was no significant difference in the girls' performances, which means there was no evidence of a stereotype lift effect. And what a stereotype lift effect is basically a performance boost one experiences that is caused by an awareness that an outgroup or a group they are not associated with is negatively stereotyped in that task. So only students that were classified as that highly identified group, so those who identified with reading and felt that reading was very important, experienced the stereotype threat. So boys underperformed relative to girls under threat, whereas the reverse occurred in the reduced threat condition. So boys actually performed better than girls. And what this revealed was a significant stereotype lift effect for those highly identified girls because they performed better in the threat condition than in the reduced threat condition. And that association was not significant for those who were classified as low identified. And then when they investigated the students' perceptions of their own performance on the task and had them self-evaluate how they felt they did in comparison to their peers, in the threat condition, boys evaluated their performance as less positively than girls did. So I do want to highlight, overall, regardless of condition, students had a positive evaluation of how they performed. It was just in the stereotype threat condition specifically, boys typically classified their performance less positively than the girls did, but in the reduced threat condition, they rated their performance as more positive than the girls' performance. So, taken together, what do all of these results indicate or imply? So, it implies that the stereotype threat about gender differences in reading may impair the boys' performance. And that underperformance was actually restricted to those who are highly motivated by reading. So those who highly valued reading and felt that reading was important to them, and that was important to be able to be good at reading. So these results indicate that the gap in the performance may reflect those boys' fear in confirming the negative stereotype about boys in reading, because that reduced threat condition canceled out the gender gap in performance. So what this suggests is that stereotype threat and stereotype lift effects can be obtained using very subtle and implicit activation, which demonstrates how truly powerful the stereotype actually is. So I just went through the key results, but please make sure you're reading that Panstout article in its entirety, because I only highlighted the main takeaways. So now I want to visit an in-class activity. So if this was in person, you all know I really enjoy small groups. So if this was in person, I would have you all break up into small groups to sort of design your own idea about potential primes. So what I want you to do on your own is think of different behaviors that you complete on a daily basis. And from all those behaviors, you choose 2 different behaviors, and then brainstorm how you feel different social factors or different environments or material information may influence that behavior. So once you go through which social factors may influence these behaviors, ask yourself, how could you design an experiment involving priming to determine if that social factor has an influence on your target behavior? So how can you create a true experiment? So using an independent variable that would involve a prime, how could you design an experiment to see if that priming influences the behavior you're thinking about? So the reason I want you all to try to do this is because it allows you to apply what you've learned in this lecture about priming, but it also helps you practice your research design skills and your understanding of independent dependent variables and your understanding of operational definitions. So this is not a graded assignment. It's purely for practice and for practicing applying, because it is important to understand these concepts and how to apply them in scenarios come time for the exam. So if you want me to check to see if you are on the right path, feel free to email me your idea. I'm more than happy to review it. Again, it's just for practice. Or if you have any questions about how you would do this activity, please feel free to reach out to me. So I did want to include some of the references I used outside of the Pansau and Kahneman book, because I talked pretty thoroughly about those, that I got information from when I was creating this lecture. So thank you all for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I'm more than happy to clarify any of the content. Thank you for watching.